Hello, you're listening to Nomado Dreams. Today we're talking about the Dalai Lama as a figure who simultaneously shapes spiritual practice and sets the cultural tone for the Tibetan community around the world. The talk will be about how the ideas he personally expresses, compassion, responsibility, and simplicity, give the institution not only religious but moral density. This matters now because the image of a leader who can speak in plain language and retain moral authority serves as a model for communities experiencing dispersal, mobility, and external pressure. The listener will take away a perspective on why the Dalai Lama's influence is measured not only by ritual, but by the way he constructs a shared picture of meaning and conduct in people's everyday lives, leaving visible traces in language, habits, and the public imagination. Where are you listening from now, and what time is it there? Write the city and time in the comments. I really enjoy seeing the geography and rhythm of the audience. If you want, take a soft deep breath, drop your shoulders, and steady your breathing. This helps you listen a little more attentively. The historical background that helps to understand the Dalai Lama's role begins with an institute that formed in Tibetan religious and political life at the end of the medieval period. The emergence of a position that combines spiritual authorship and worldly influence cannot be considered separately from the school to which this line related, and from the social practices through which it was legitimized. It is important to see that this was not simply a religious title. Around the person gathered administration, education, artistic patronage, and systems of mutual obligation within the community. This set of functions made the leader's role recognizable and significant for very different social strata. A short note on the origin of the institution gives useful context, but it is not worth dwelling on biography for long. The institution itself arose as a combination of monastic authority and political necessity. Inheritance of the position through a system of reincarnations secured long-term continuity. Within this scheme, the leader acted as bearer and authorized interpreter of the teaching, which gave him the right to shape the everyday practice of millions of people. This method of organizing power allowed the shared system of meanings to be maintained under the complex geopolitics of the Tibetan plateau. A brief biographical remark about the contemporary line remains useful. The current Dalai Lama became a public figure whose statements and meetings with international audiences have garnered attention far beyond the Tibetan cultural circle. Such biographical details serve only to anchor ideas to a real person and to a concrete historical moment when the institution faced new tasks of legitimation and communication. These tasks required a transformation of style and methods for conveying meaning to different audiences. The role of a spiritual leader in the understanding of the Dalai Lama manifests above all as the formation of a collective image of the world through which people orient their actions. The leader constructs a language of values: how to speak about compassion, why responsibility for another's suffering matters, which everyday practices are considered worthy. Such a language functions as a soft architecture, setting the boundaries of permissible behavior and shaping norms of solidarity. People absorb this architecture through sermons, conversations, public speeches, and personal example. The function of mentor here is combined with the practical clarification of abstract concepts. Compassion ceases to be a utopian declaration and becomes a set of concrete guidelines: how to build relationships, how to respond to injury, which priorities to set when choosing a life course. The teacher makes ideas trainable, turning them into habits. As a result, people learn to recognize moments when care can be shown and gain a vocabulary for describing meaningful moral choices. The communicative style of the contemporary Dalai Lama deserves special attention because it operates at the intersection of simplicity and depth. This concerns the choice of words, pace, and images that make complex Buddhist ideas accessible to audiences with different educational and cultural backgrounds. Everyday metaphors and direct examples from ordinary life are often used, so that the listener is drawn into reflection rather than distanced from it. This style reduces the distance between teacher and listener without losing authority. Humor in public speeches functions as a communicative key. With a smile and light self-irony, difficult topics become less frightening, and the audience gains the opportunity to accept an idea without defensive reactions. This creates openness to ideas that might otherwise meet resistance due to cultural or intellectual distance. Humor as a device strengthens trust and eases personal integration into the proposed moral schemes. Directness and clarity are an important component of the style. The rejection of fashionable buzzwords in favor of clear definitions allows focus to remain on the essence. What is harm? What is benefit? Which motives make an action good? In such definitions, the influence of a rational language is noticeable. Its strive for testability and comprehensibility. This approach turns moral reasoning into material suitable for discussion, compatible with scientific rhetoric and everyday practices. The method of presenting ideas combines respect for tradition with a readiness for linguistic modernization. On the one hand, canonical concepts and historical formulas are preserved. On the other, these concepts are translated into the language of contemporary experience, described through ideas from psychology, ethics, and social responsibility. This movement shortens the distance between ancient texts and current moral dilemmas faced by people living in mobile societies and fast information exchanges. The model of leadership built along this line relies on an authority created not by external symbols, but by a sequence of actions and speech practices. Authority arises thanks to a combination of factors: personal modesty, consistent preaching of simple values, constant attention to people's suffering, and the ability to explain why these values matter now. It is important to see that respect is built through the visible congruence of words and deeds. The influence of the communicative style spreads to institutional practice as well. Decisions and recommendations coming from the leader take on the form of understandable guidance. This makes it possible to coordinate collective actions at the level of the diaspora, educational programs, and social initiatives. When advice is expressed in clear language and supported by examples, it becomes a practical tool for the organized life of the community. Finally, there is a constant tension between preserving a deep religious tradition and adapting the language so as to be heard by an international public. This tension is resolved through the choice of images and style that leave room for the sacred meaning while opening space for dialogue with people of other cultural traditions. Such a compromise forms a unique manner of leadership where sacredness intersects with the universality of moral propositions. Each of these directions, the institutional role and the communicative strategy, functions as a mechanism of legitimation. The institution provides the historical foundation and the structure of interactions, and the communicative style turns that structure into a living resource capable of mobilizing attention and sympathy. Together, they create the image of a leader whose power has cultural density and practical applicability in many different contexts of people's lives. Keeping these themes turning in the mind, it is useful to hold in focus the question of how specific rhetorical devices affect the behavior of individuals. A set of words and examples can change the way a person perceives another's pain and decides whether to help. Such a practical link between word and action is a central feature of the philosophy that here manifests as an ethic of communication. From this base, one should further consider how historical changes and political circumstances transform the institution and style while preserving key lines of meaning. When the institution faces the mobilization of a diaspora and international attention, the ways of speaking and acting become critically important for preserving identity and trust. This moment brings the personal presence of the leader and the collective memory of the people into a single field of meaning, where word and image influence people's practices and choices. The origin of the Reincarnation Institute fits into a practical logic of maintaining continuity of knowledge and power through changes of personalities. The description of this logic begins with a simple observation. Stable traditions require a mechanism that links the past with the present at the level of trust and authority. Reincarnation functions as such a mechanism because it shifts the focus of legitimation from a formal transfer of rights to the symbolic heritage of a person, perceived as the continued presence of the same teaching in different bodies. This possibility of continuation gives meaning to long-term educational projects, monastic courses, and temple practice, and provides predictability for those social ties that rely on ritual authority. The mechanics of recognizing reincarnations were formed through a chain of social procedures and symbolic practices. Early evidence points to the involvement in these procedures of spiritual masters, experienced lamas, and representatives of monastic administration. In the search process, they relied on a combination of announcements, practical tests, and corroborated testimonies. This combination of ritual experience and institutional verification turns personal conviction into collective empiricism. Confirmation of a reincarnation goes beyond private belief and becomes a matter of public recognition, with wide consequences for management of resources and education. The economic and administrative side of the institution is important for understanding the whole system. Establishing the reincarnate as head of a monastery or spiritual line was often accompanied by the allocation of land, donations, and rights to manage assets. These material bases supported educational programs and practices of community care. The link between sacred succession and economic resource created a structure in which spiritual authority and practical responsibility interacted daily, forming the conditions under which the leader's word could be turned into concrete actions and distribution of benefits. The cultural effect of this practice is expressed in the creation of collective memory that turns attention to long time horizons. People within the system begin to perceive leadership as something more than the personal charisma of an individual. The transition of identity across generations forms an expectation of the durability of the teaching, the frameworks of spiritual life, lines of instruction, and artistic ritual practices. Such memory acts as a dense fabric binding rituals, texts, and behavioral models, and allows the community to withstand external shocks while preserving a recognizable cultural profile. The philosophical foundation of the institution rests on the notion of karma and the causal continuity of actions that retain their influence beyond a single life. This view places responsibility on the one declared bearer of the previous practice. The expectation of ethical maturity and continuation of practical instructions creates a moral benchmark for the figure itself. That benchmark operates simultaneously as a moral imperative and as a mechanism of autonomous control. Society gains criteria for evaluating the leader's activity, and the leader gains motive to demonstrate congruence between behavior and teaching. The ritual symbolic side of recognition includes the use of sacred texts, methods of divination, and special tests for identifying objects from a previous life. These practices function as a language of trust. Symbolic actions and ritual confirmations introduce a broad audience to the logic of succession. The significance of these actions goes beyond purely evidentiary order. They consolidate collective belief through visible procedures that are accepted as legitimate within the shared semantics of religious life. As a result, the confirmation process becomes both a spiritual practice and a public act of institutional order. The role of the educated elite within the monastic and secular environment in forming this institution requires attention. Scholars and mentors prepared candidates to perform functions, ensured continuity of curricula, and secured interpretations of the canons. Such support transformed the individual status into a public function. The educated reincarnation could rely on networks of pedagogical support and the monastic structure on a systematized transmission of knowledge. This organization of education makes the institution resilient to accidental changes and contributes to the formation of a professional culture of governance. The consequences for the political organization of the region were profound. In cases where the reincarnate became a subject of influence on administrative processes, the legitimacy of the institution provided a transmission line between religious tradition and secular power. Such integration created policies in which sacred identity had practical significance for decisions about land distribution, appointments of officials, and mediation in disputes. In this sense, the reincarnation institution became part of the state infrastructure of governance, with long-term consequences for the stability of regional institutions. Critical vulnerabilities of the institution are revealed at moments when social or political conditions change faster than traditional procedures can adapt. Such situations lead to uncertainty about the origin of authority and create space for various interpretations. In these conditions, the system's ability to renew itself depends on the flexibility of recognition procedures, on the willingness of religious institutions to engage in discussion, and on the extent to which public trust rests on a broad base of practical competence and transparency of actions. The ethical logic of succession affects internal dynamics of expectations toward the leader. There is a demand for constancy of moral standards and for the ability to handle life's variability without losing authority. This creates pressure for demonstrating correspondence between word and deed, since society comes to measure the leader's work by criteria of continuity of tradition and adaptive competence. The form of responsibility becomes part of the ritual contract. The leader is perceived as bearer of obligation to both the past and the future at once. Interpretations of the institution over the centuries included various theoretical justifications. Some developed the thesis of a transcendent connection between bodies. Others emphasized the role of collective intention and memory in creating a sense of unity of lines. These disagreements were reflected in practical diversity of procedures. In some places, the emphasis was on external signs and phenomena. Elsewhere, on deep rites of inner recognition. This diversity became a resource for adaptation, because different communities could choose the forms of confirmation that best suited their social context. In the contemporary context, the discussion of the reincarnation institution is linked to questions of legitimacy and transformation of procedures. Public attention and international media practices introduced new demands for transparency and argumentation. These demands stimulate reforms and the rethinking of methods for searching and recognizing. The application of criteria of clarity and explainability helps the institution retain trust in an expanding public sphere, while at the same time preserving the deep ritual meanings that matter to the community. A concluding thought on the origin of the institution concerns its dual nature as a practical technique of governance and as a philosophical response to the problem of continuity of meaning. The institution organizes the transfer of role through symbols and procedures, and it also formulates a particular representation of time, responsibility, and human connection with the past. Understanding this combination helps to see why the system of reincarnations preserved viability in difficult historical conditions, and why questions of its adaptation remain key for the institution's future. The role of the Dalai Lama in Tibetan society included many functions that simultaneously had religious, educational, and administrative dimensions. He acted as a center of existential understanding and as an institution around which everyday practices and collective orientation were built. This combination made it possible to integrate complex philosophical ideas into the structure of social life, making them accessible to broad layers of the population and turning abstract teachings into concrete guides for behavior. Ritual activity occupied a noticeable place in the system of duties. Public ceremonies, reading of sacred texts, and presiding over complex rites reinforced the link between teaching and collective memory. These events served as markers of time for the community. They structured agricultural cycles and family rituals, providing predictability of social life through symbolic actions and repeatable practices. Ethical influence manifested in the formation of moral exemplars. Teachings on compassion and responsibility became the basis for social norms, set criteria for judging actions, and created expectations about people's behavior in various life circumstances. The leadership figure regulated the moral economy of the community because its ideas were reflected in rules of interaction between neighbors, in relationships within families, and in institutional standards of monasteries. The administrative role combined spiritual leadership with practical care for material resources. Monarchical and monastic structures were linked through an institution that supervised distribution of donations, land management, and provision of educational programs. Such governance was part of everyday reality. The institution's decisions affected the living conditions of whole communities and the organization of work for those who depended on monastic services. Judicial functions held an important place in the social order. The leader acted as an arbitrator in disputes. His decision carried moral force sufficient to settle conflicts without recourse to violent methods. Acceptance of verdicts relied on the authority of the teaching and on the ability to relate private interests to general principles of justice, which provided legitimacy and reduced tension in local relations. The educational system was influenced by this figure through curatorship of curricula and mentorship of senior lamas. Courses in philosophy, logic, and ritual practices were supported and coordinated by the institution, which set teaching standards. Such influence created continuity of knowledge and formed an elite able to manage monastic affairs and serve as intermediaries between the textual tradition and the community. The public image served as a linking element between the elite and the masses. Demonstrations of humility, attention to ordinary people, and participation in social initiatives strengthened the perception of the leader as someone attuned to the population's needs. This image functioned as a social tool, fostering trust and reducing the distance between the institution and those seeking support in spiritual and everyday matters. Preservation of language and artistic practices was among the tasks carried out through ceremonies and educational activities. Literature, poetry, and iconography received institutional patronage, which helped to form a canon of cultural values. Monastic schools and scholarships supported artisans and scribes, whose work became material of collective memory and of the educational program. Daily, everyday life was woven into frameworks established through the ritual calendar. Festivals and fasts ordered time and gave participants collective experiences that reinforced identity. These practices shaped habits and ritual skills, giving meaning to everyday actions and creating stable patterns of interaction within communities. Intellectual responsibility was expressed in public commentary on philosophical questions and in participation in debates about the moral organization of society. The leader formed interpretations of doctrine that were then transmitted through educational texts and oral instructions. Such activity delineated the limits of permissible interpretation and helped preserve the coherence of the theoretical line on which the behavior of many followers was based. The economic base guaranteed the institution's stability. A network of donations, land use rights, and income distribution created a financial structure that made it possible to sustain schools, hospitals, and charitable projects. These mechanisms made the leader's influence in real life tangible and gave his decisions practical significance under conditions of limited resources. Religious authority became a criterion for personal and public responsibility. The expectation that words and deeds correspond would create a system of control where moral reputation directly affected the leader's ability to influence public processes. Public trust was formed through visible examples of discipline and consistency that served as models for imitation in everyday situations. The role in the art of time management was connected with the notion of continuity. The institution provided a planning horizon, allowing educational programs and economic projects to rely on long-term calculations. This approach reduced the fragmentation of decision-making and contributed to the sustainable development of communal practices. Mechanisms of legitimation included public testimonies that praised the connection between teaching and everyday life. Doctrinal explanations were combined with ritual demonstrations, creating a multi-layered system of trust. People interacted with this mechanism through participation in public acts, through receiving instruction, and through experience that confirmed the significance of prescribed norms. The connection with the world of crafts and agriculture manifested itself in institutions providing a moral and organizational framework for cooperation. Monastic estates provided technological and economic stability in territories where other forms of organization were weakly developed. This made spiritual leadership an important element of support for the viability of local communities. The internal discipline of the clergy was maintained through a system of education and regular inspections. Traditional exams, practical observations, and mentoring relationships formed the professional standard. Such regulation allowed the quality of teaching and ritual practice to be preserved and ensured the continuity of competence among those holding responsible positions. Expectations of the leader included the ability to foresee the moral consequences of political decisions. His words carried weight in assessing social transformations, making the institution an important participant in discussions about societal development. Such participation formed a spatial logic of governance in which religious meanings and pragmatic decisions were in constant interaction. The image of the mentor manifested itself through simple, accessible formulations and metaphors. These communicative techniques made abstract ideas vitally applicable. Explanations concerned not only metaphysics, but also everyday morality, which increased the practical relevance of the teaching for broad segments of the population. Boundaries of influence were established by official and informal procedures. Ritual rites and administrative duties defined the field within which the leader could make changes. This institutional configuration created conditions for systemic governance while limiting arbitrariness and strengthening the durability of decisions. The function of education went beyond the monastery walls. Teaching spread through traveling mentors and local schools, where elements of philosophy became part of everyday thinking. Such reach strengthened the coherence of the cultural field and contributed to a shared understanding of good and duty among different layers of society. Understanding of the public good was formed through the lens of compassion. This moral core served as a guide for distributing aid, for setting priorities in social service, and for developing norms that governed relations between different groups. This moral orientation influenced support practices and helped form collective solidarity. Closing the consideration of this role, it is important to note that the integration of philosophy and everyday life creates a unique form of social capital. The leadership figure served as a center in which doctrinal positions became instruments of life, and the institution gained meaning through its ability to guide the community in complex conditions of social organization. Exile became a point of regrouping responsibilities and meanings, during which former administrative functions acquired a different form and scale. Leaving the territory deprived them of reliable access to material resources and institutions of power, so the center of gravity shifted toward symbolic work and communication, where the philosophical component proved to be a key resource. This transformation was fueled by the conviction that the meaning of leadership is measured not by the strength of territorial control, but by the ability to preserve and transmit the moral content of the teaching in new conditions. Administrative tasks acquired the structure of networked governance. Managing donations, distributing aid, and supporting educational programs became matters of coordination among numerous dispersed communities. Such operations relied on institutional mechanisms that combined traditional accounting practices with modern means of communication and organization. The aim was to create systems in which priority setting was based on principles of compassion and efficiency, rather than on old feudal forms of power. The communicative strategy acquired strategic significance. Public addresses unfolded in the international arena, where the language of morality and ethics replaced former managerial statements. In this context, philosophical formulations about compassion and responsibility served as instruments of political influence. They functioned as a discipline of argumentation, and at the same time created an ethos that a broad circle of supporters in different cultures could rely on. Internal legitimation began with practices of transparency and education. Leadership decisions came to be accompanied by explanations that withstood logical scrutiny and corresponded to the principles of Buddhist thought. Such practice strengthened trust in the authority by demonstrating consistency between word and deed. Thus, the leader's moral capital was maintained by demonstrable management practices which facilitated the attraction of resources and community support. The education system became a point of identity consolidation in exile. Courses in language, philosophy, and culture were prioritized as a means of preserving heritage. At the same time, new educational formats were created that combined classical studies with modern management skills. This approach made it possible to prepare leaders and administrators capable of acting in diaspora conditions where organizational skills coexisted with religious competence. Ritual practices underwent pragmatic reworking. Ceremonies adapted to living conditions in a foreign country. They preserved their semantic structure, but changed form and scheduling. These changes performed not only utilitarian tasks, but also reinforced a sense of community through accessible participation. Thanks to this, ritual remained a binding node of collective memory, even when people were dispersed across different states. Dialogue with external audiences developed as a pedagogical project. Appeals to an international public were built on comprehensible images and metaphors that made Buddhist ethics applicable to global problems. Such work expanded the field of influence, translating local experiences of loss into universal values that could foster international solidarity and draw attention to the fate of the community. Mobilization mechanisms underwent institutionalization. Volunteer networks, charitable foundations, and local committees became part of a permanent infrastructure, and their activities were coordinated through centralized channels. This connectivity made large-scale projects possible in education, healthcare, and cultural transmission. The philosophical reliance on compassion here functioned not as mere rhetoric, but as a criterion for resource allocation and evaluation of results. The public image became an instrument of diplomacy. The leader's presentation combined customary modesty with the readiness to speak on international platforms. This combination made it possible to achieve moral resonance in audiences that value clarity of argument and the humanity of example. Thus, the leader's image functioned as a bridge translating religious reflection into the sphere of international politics and civic engagement. Legitimation processes were complemented by democratic practices. In exile, procedures emerged aimed at involving broad segments of the community in decision-making. These practices provided diaspora institutions with greater stability, since decisions began to reflect not only traditional authoritative structures, but also collective expectations. This evolution contributed to the institution's resilience under prolonged loss of territorial control. Reflection on identity became a constant theme of public speeches. Discussion on the significance of culture, language, and memory acquired a critical function in maintaining the community's moral integrity. The philosophical line linking compassion and social responsibility turned into a practical program for educating the next generation, where education included value orientation and practices of social solidarity. Communication technologies radically expanded the field of influence. Radio, print, and later the internet and social platforms made it possible to conduct educational and spiritual work at a distance. This allowed regular contact between the center and the periphery to be maintained, which in turn ensured the continuity of teaching and the responsiveness of administrative decisions. Technologies acted as a medium that preserved the continuity of meanings under conditions of physical dispersion. Financial organization became a complex hybrid of traditional donations and modern forms of fundraising. Creating a stable economic base required combining ritual collection of funds with transparent reporting to donors. This combination increased the trust of external partners and provided the foundation for long-term aid and development programs. Ethical argumentation rooted demand for support within a framework of value-based solidarity. The role of courts and arbitration underwent institutional changes. The formation of dispute resolution procedures in the diaspora relied on a combination of traditional precedents and the modern legal norms of host states. These procedures ensured the stability of social relations and helped preserve moral authority through fair conflict resolution. The practice of arbitration included an educational component aimed at forming legal awareness in new conditions. Ethical pedagogy acquired a public function. The teaching of compassion took practical form in programs of assistance, mentorship, and social work. In such programs, philosophical positions were translated into tools for solving concrete problems: conflicts, job loss, adaptation to a new culture. This contributed to the spread of ethics as a social technique, rather than as an abstract doctrine. Intercultural adaptation affected language and style of presentation. Translating philosophical concepts into accessible everyday use required careful selection of terms and the creation of new linguistic renovations. These efforts had a dual payoff. They preserved the depth of the tradition while making it understandable to those who had not grown up within old ritual practices. The result was an expanded audience and stronger integration of ideas into local educational programs. Self-governing bodies in exile became an experimental laboratory for combining tradition and modernity. Practical decisions on the distribution of land, property, and social services required the development of normative mechanisms that took into account religious prescriptions and the legislation of host countries. At the same time, philosophical reflection on justice and duty became the basis for legal argumentation and organizational design. Cultural work took on a missionary but not expansionist character. Creating theatrical productions, music festivals, and literary publications served the task of maintaining internal cohesion and attracting sympathy from outside. These initiatives presented heritage as a living practice, which helped form a durable visual and auditory identity in new living conditions. Tools for evaluating project effectiveness became part of managerial culture. Record keeping, monitoring, and public reporting gained importance for maintaining trust, both within the community and among international partners. Such practices embedded requirements for effectiveness into governance, making institutional efforts transparent and open to critique, and thus to improvement. Ethical rhetoric turned into a form of international legal argumentation. Appeals to universal values and human dignity were used as resources when addressing international organizations and human rights structures. This approach increased the visibility of the issue and made it part of a global agenda in which the moral voice could influence political decisions through public opinion and legal procedures. The network of mentors became decentralized, which made it possible to maintain practice in very diverse social contexts. Personal ties between teacher and student, combined with mass educational programs that ensured the spread of the basics of the teaching without losing depth. Such a combined system of instruction supported the continuity of practice and provided flexibility in adapting to local conditions. Questions of succession became a public topic of discussion within the community. Debates about the principles for choosing and confirming successors and continuers of the tradition reshaped institutional procedures toward greater transparency and involvement. These procedures evolved in ways that sought to preserve the stability of the symbolic core, while also taking new realities of life in dispersion into account. Social assistance practices became a measure of the philosophy's effectiveness. Assessing the success of aid programs by indicators of reduced suffering and restored social ties showed that the teaching of compassion works as a practical method of public governance. This empirical verification strengthened authority since philosophical positions gained confirmation in observable results. The leader's role in exile also became that of a strategic communicator. The synthesis of a moral message and organizational steps made it possible to build long-term campaigns for preserving language, culture, and education. Communication oriented people toward concrete actions and shaped a collective agenda capable of enduring prolonged periods of uncertainty. Between heritage and adaptation, a special practical philosophy formed. This line preserved respect for traditions while signaling a readiness to change forms in order to preserve essence. Such a philosophical stance allowed ritual and educational practices to be delicately translated into new social and legal contexts, ensuring their viability. Concluding the analysis of transformations, it can be said that exile changed the institutional logic. Former centralization of power yielded to a flexible network of meanings and practices where the philosophical foundation became the main binding element. This restructuring made it possible to continue transmitting the teaching, preserve moral authority, and build sustainable institutional mechanisms under conditions of prolonged lack of territorial control. A political strategy oriented toward nonviolence relies on a link between ethics and tactics. Compassion becomes not only a moral imperative, but also an instrument of influence that shapes the agenda and the behavior of international actors. This line reconfigures the political field so that moral authority becomes a resource capable of mobilizing attention, resources, and diplomatic support. Within such an approach, the key task is to create a coherent narrative that withstands factual scrutiny and resonates with diverse audiences. The origins of such a strategy lie in Buddhist ethics, where causality and interdependence serve as the basis for peaceful methods. When addressing external instances, arguments draw on notions of dignity, suffering, and responsibility, articulated in public speeches, educational programs, and diplomatic initiatives. These appeals construct the image of a moral subject with whom it is easier to build dialogue and seek compromises on international platforms. Practical implementation of a nonviolent strategy requires clear organization, preparing the message, coordinating the diaspora's actions, building legal arguments, and applying modern communication technologies. This set of measures functions as a unified system in which each element reinforces the others. Legal argumentation strengthens public appeals, educational projects form long-term support, and cultural initiatives make the issue understandable and close to new audiences. A vector toward patient diplomacy creates tactical flexibility. The importance of endurance is manifested in the ability to use pauses, symbolic gestures, and international procedures to keep the issue on the agenda. Targeted campaigns involving public institutions and NGOs create an effect of constant presence in global discourse, which sustains the interest and attention necessary to advance human rights and cultural preservation issues. This approach requires community discipline. Prepared campaigns and coordinated public responses reduce the risk of emotional outbursts that can undermine trust. Internal communication mechanisms, training community representatives, and developing common standards of conduct ensure coherence of action and strengthen reputation as a reliable partner in dialogue with states and international organizations. Public rhetoric is built around concrete images that make abstract concepts understandable. Depicting suffering through specific stories, using metaphors, translating philosophical concepts into the language of daily concerns. These images function as bridges between different cultural contexts. They evoke empathy and encourage institutions to support initiatives based on humanitarian principles and international norms. International support, to which a nonviolent strategy leads, forms gradually. First, sympathies appear in academic and humanitarian circles. Then coalitions form among NGOs and the media, after which political institutions get involved. This dynamic makes it possible to attract resources and exert pressure on host states through legal and reputational channels, expanding the space for negotiation and protection of cultural rights. The limitation of such a strategy lies in its dependence on the perception of the international community. When the public image is successfully realized, it brings support. When the context changes or attention shifts to other problems, effectiveness diminishes. For this reason, continuous work is required to update arguments, maintain informational activity, and develop new forms of engagement with different audiences in order to preserve relevance and resilience of influence. Interaction with legal institutions serves as an additional tool that complements humanitarian appeals. Prepared dossiers, participation in international conventions, and appeals to human rights bodies create a formal platform for discussing problems grounded in norms and precedents. This work makes it possible to attract attention at the level of decisions and recommendations that carry weight in diplomatic practice. Ritual and symbolic practices function as media for political messages. Public ceremonies, cultural actions, and visual symbols become a means of marking values and forming collective memory. Their power is manifested in the ability to concentrate attention and create an emotional bond that sustains long-term commitment to the cause and allows disparate communities to unite around a common history and goals. The role of the leader in this strategy is a combination of personal ethics and organizational effort. Private habits, manner of communication, and consistency in public actions shape trust, which then transforms into political capital. This capital is used in negotiations, where moral authority helps build trust with partners and strengthens persuasive power in international dialogues. Tactical steps include creating platforms for peaceful resistance that rely on educational campaigns and legal literacy. Preparing activists and community leaders, familiarizing them with international norms and mechanisms for addressing institutions, increases the chances of turning a moral stance into effective appeals and projects. Such platforms provide a steady flow of information and initiatives that maintain the visibility of the issue and its relevance. The internal energy of the community is directed through institutions that build long-term readiness for peaceful struggle. Schools, cultural centers, and foundations act as reservoirs of knowledge and resources, ensuring continuity of programs and resilience of activities in a changing external environment. Investments in such institutions create the infrastructure necessary for systematic work on the international stage. Adapting tactics to new technologies becomes an element of survival and influence expansion.
The use of digital platforms, media campaigns, and network communities allows for audience growth and faster response to informational challenges. Public communications through modern channels create an effect of direct interaction that lowers barriers between center and periphery and makes broad engagement possible. Criteria for effectiveness include not only quantitative participation metrics, but also measurement of impact on attitudes toward the problem, institutions' readiness for dialogue, and real policy changes. Evaluation requires a combination of statistics, qualitative research, and historical comparisons to see which forms of influence work and which need revision. Such an approach makes the strategy adaptive and aids in correct prioritization. Symbolism acts as a central mechanism for strengthening identity in conditions of dispersion. Wearable and visually represented culture forms a sense of belonging and serves as a tool of cultural reproduction. Clothing, ritual objects, festivals, and artistic practices create visual codes that convey meaning and history. Their significance is amplified by repetition and accessibility across generations. The process of constructing symbols includes choosing narratives and visual forms that remain recognizable in different cultural contexts. The balance between traditional form and intelligibility for external audiences is important here. Within the community, symbols function as an anchor for everyday practice, while outside the community, they perform the roles of identification and emotional engagement of supporters. The public image of the leader synthesizes elements of personal ethics and cultural codes, becoming a means of international representation. This image strengthens ties between religious tradition and civic participation. Modesty in daily life, accessibility, and simplicity of expression are turned into moral rhetoric, understandable to diverse audiences. It is this aesthetic that creates trust and facilitates dialogue with institutions and the masses. Articulation of cultural identity uses educational institutions as platforms for transmitting language and traditions. Programs aimed at studying language, history, and art build a long-term foundation of preservation, based on systematic cultivation of new generations. These programs are tasked with preserving the cultural code and forming collective memory, which is important for identity resilience. Symbolic practices are constantly reinterpreted in conditions of migration and contact with other traditions. Such transformations give rise to new forms of expression that retain meaning in a changed context. Artistic expressions, musical adaptations,
and theatrical productions function as a living archive of culture, where elements undergo renewal and gain a chance for long life. The commercial attractiveness of cultural symbols carries complex consequences. On the one hand, it helps spread culture and attract resources. On the other hand, commercialization can dilute meaning and simplify complex traditions. Working on frameworks for the use of cultural imagery and creating ethical standards for presenting heritage serve as ways to preserve the dignity and depth of symbols in the public sphere. Intergenerational transmission of identity requires creating support structures where young people have space for learning and practice. This includes mentorship, grants for creativity, platforms for exchange of experience, and initiatives that connect practitioners and scholars. Supporting young bearers of culture strengthens continuity and increases the chances of preserving language and traditions in new social circumstances. Symbols perform a diplomatic function, influencing international audiences through emotional and cultural codes. They create a favorable impression and can soften political tensions, attracting sympathy and support. Using cultural messages in diplomacy requires delicacy and conscious management to preserve semantic integrity and avoid distortions. A limitation of symbolism is its dependence on institutional support. Without schools, cultural centers, and sustainable funded programs, symbols lose their operative power. Therefore, symbolic work is always accompanied by organizational activity that ensures regularity of practices and supports the educational processes necessary for preserving meanings. The strategy of preserving identity includes monitoring the influence of symbols on community behavior and adjusting practices. Analyzing public reaction, studying youth engagement, and evaluating cultural programs help understand which forms work best. Such analytics enable continuous improvement and prevent the development of stereotypes that could cement simplified representations of a complex tradition. The convergence of a nonviolence policy and work with symbolism forms a single practical philosophy where moral stances serve as a toolkit for social and international activity. The combination of dialogue, legal argumentation, and cultural representation creates a resilient strategy grounded in deep ethical foundations and the ability to adapt to a changing world. Open questions still require work, but the chosen line demonstrates how a philosophical position can be transformed into systemic forms of influence and identity preservation. Communication with the Western audience is a deliberate philosophical act in which the semantic centers of Buddhist thought are translated into the language of everyday morality and scientific rationality. Two linked processes occur in such a translation: simplifying formulations for the sake of comprehensibility and preserving the depth of meanings for the integrity of the teaching. These processes are governed by the choice of words, the structure of explanations, and the format of dialogue, each element serving the task of establishing trust and opening a space for practice. The choice of linguistic images is built around metaphors familiar to a wide range of people and concrete examples from life, which facilitates the perception of abstract ideas. Instead of complex terms, there are descriptions of mechanisms: how compassion manifests in attention to specific suffering, how the mind is trained through repetitive actions, how motivation changes the meaning of deeds. This approach allows philosophical positions to be presented as claims testable in experience, suitable for everyday implementation. Appeal to secular ethics is based on a common human sensitivity to suffering and the desire for well-being. The philosophical logic here is simple. If causality and interdependence explain life processes, joint practice of mindfulness and compassion is an instrument for improving relationships and quality of life. Such argumentation resonates with academic circles and public institutions, because it offers practical consequences without mandatory attachment to dogma. The communicative style includes directness and dialogicality, expressed in a willingness to answer questions and conduct discussion in the form of exchange with listeners. This format reduces distance between teacher and audience, makes criticism part of the process, and turns public talks into platforms for collective reflection. Dialogical methodology activates independent understanding in listeners and supports development of responsibility for their own practice. Humor and simplicity of speech function as instruments of authority with a low level of pressure. Light irony toward one's own limitations and the use of everyday analogies create an atmosphere of accessibility. This atmosphere helps listeners perceive ideas not as a demand for submission, but as an invitation to experience and verification. The ethical strength of the teaching is preserved through constant return to principles and practices. When key concepts are translated into Western languages, a choice of semantic frames occurs that determines how the idea is understood. In such cases, the emphasis is placed on descriptive equivalents that show the function of a term in a person's life rather than its ontological load. Describing a practice as a way of transforming attention and motivation gives listeners the opportunity to connect the concept with personal experiences and assess its effectiveness without prior acceptance of a religious worldview. Collaboration with scientific disciplines implements the idea of testing ethical and practical claims through empirical methods. The interface between meditative practice and neuroscience is framed as a platform for verifying effects and developing ethically justified interventions. The synergy of science and practice strengthens institutional trust and opens space for implementing programs in education and healthcare. Pedagogical organization is a key element in transmitting ideas. Public lectures are accompanied by simple exercises and recommendations for independent practice, making sessions part of everyday life. The format is oriented towards repeatability and verifiability, which creates conditions for sustained change in thinking habits. This pedagogical approach reflects the philosophical principle that understanding is confirmed by experience and practice. Media communication shapes the image of the teacher and his ideas in accessible visual and verbal codes, which stimulates public interest but simultaneously raises the question of preserving semantic depth. To address this problem, additional educational resources and programs are created that allow going beyond superficial perception. This multi-level approach reduces the risk of reducing the teaching to a set of fashionable practices and supports academic and practical elaboration. Adapting ritual forms and practices to the Western context develops as a process of gradual transformation in which the basic functions of rites are preserved while formal external elements change. The semantic centralization of practice shifts toward ethical and psychological impact, making rites intelligible in urban life conditions and integrable into new social roles. The evolution of forms demonstrates the tradition's ability to retain a core of meaning while external conditions change. Cultural translation requires attention to linguistic and symbolic nuances to avoid simplifications that erase historical and philosophical context. For this purpose, translation and teaching programs are created that include explanations of the historical foundations of ideas and their logical consequences, as well as a dialogue about possible interpretations. Supporting this work helps form a responsible audience, capable of distinguishing levels of meaning and assessing the practical applicability of ideas. The emergence of secular interpretations of meditation has caused widespread dissemination of practices oriented to well-being and stress reduction, alongside the simultaneous rise of commercial modes of distribution. To preserve philosophical integrity,
criteria are developed for the quality transmission of practice and ethical standards for teachers. These measures aim to maintain the connection between technique and its philosophical foundations, preventing reduction to purely utilitarian methods. Influence on the Western academy is reflected in the emergence of new disciplines, where philosophical ideas become objects of analytical study and experimental verification. This creates space for critical reflection and refinement of concepts about human nature, morality, and consciousness. Academic work provides tools for deep interpretation of practices and their integration into educational programs aimed at cultivating responsibility and civic maturity. The language of public addresses is used as a tool for forming a common frame of thought, where key categorical concepts are translated into everyday frameworks. Working descriptions of such categories emphasize causal links that are easy to demonstrate through simple exercises and observable changes in behavior. The pragmatic nature of formulations makes it possible to build a bridge between abstract theories and concrete steps accessible for implementation in family and professional life. Long-term effects of such communication are manifested in changing cultural expectations regarding leadership, compassion, and social responsibility. Forming a new norm implies gradual introduction of practices into educational and medical institutions, which changes attitudes toward emotional literacy and interpersonal ethics. These changes are supported by links between philosophy and institutions, where moral principles receive institutional form. Limits of communication lie in the impossibility of fully conveying inner discipline and contextual meanings through short public formats. To maintain depth of practice, institutions are needed that provide systematic training and an environment for sustained practice. Philosophical integrity is preserved through a combination of public dissemination of ideas and the creation of supportive structures where knowledge is deepened and integrated into life. Interaction with Western culture shapes the philosophical line as a project aimed at spreading the principle of interdependence and developing practical ethics. Such a project requires continuous work on language, methods, and institutions, so that ideas remain both comprehensible and deeply substantive. The result is an expansion of the field of ethical responsibility, in which philosophical positions on compassion and accountability become real instruments of change in social practice. The dialogue with science has taken shape as a methodological and philosophical experiment, in which practices of mindfulness and compassion become a field for empirical testing and conceptual clarification. This dialogue raises questions about methods for verifying subjective experience, about the status of the first person in consciousness research, and about what criteria should be considered sufficient to claim a transformation of mind. The answers influence how the tradition constructs its arguments and which aspects of the teaching it emphasizes when interacting with public institutions. The model of collaboration includes creating laboratory protocols to study changes associated with regular practice. These protocols record parameters of practice, duration, frequency of sessions, and baseline questionnaires, which allow statistical correlation of practice with changes in attention, emotion regulation, and psychophysiological indicators. The aim of this approach is not only to demonstrate effects, but also to clarify the mechanisms through which changes occur, creating a language for interaction with clinical practice and educational programs. At the same time, philosophical reflection on methods is developing. The question of how to reconcile qualitative reports of practitioners with quantitative data requires development of integrative methodologies, including interval-based first-person measurements.
This entails revising notions of validity and reliability in areas where subjective experience is a central source of information, and prompts the creation of new standards for documenting and analyzing experiences. The appearance of interdisciplinary centers has become an institutional form of dialogue, where researchers from neuroscience, psychology, and philosophy work together with practitioners and teachers. In such environments, priority is given not only to verifying effects, but also to discussing ethical frameworks for research, preparing teaching materials, and translation work that make theoretical aspects of practices understandable to the academic community. Centers perform the function of bridges between systems of knowledge and public demands for improving well-being. Experimental results have provided grounds for theoretical debates about the plasticity of attention and morality. Neuroplastic changes in systems related to regulation of attention and empathy have become the subject of discussion about how long-term practice affects the structure of motivations and habits. These discussions reflect the philosophical task of rethinking the nature of moral development as a process that combines learning, repetition, and inner reflection, and they form arguments in favor of including practices in educational strategies. At the same time, concerns have arisen about the risks of reductionism. Scientific verification increases trust in practices, but a methodological focus on measurable indicators can shift attention away from the semantic and normative side of the teaching. To preserve integrity, it is important to keep explanations at the level of philosophical foundations, showing that changes in neural patterns are part of the story rather than its conclusion. This approach requires researchers and practitioners to be willing to work with multi-layered descriptions. The practical side of the dialogue manifests in the creation of programs for healthcare and education, where elements of traditional practice are adapted to clinical and pedagogical conditions. Developing protocols for therapeutic application relies on experimental verification as well as ethical criteria that include respect for the original tradition and transparency of teaching methods. This turns scientific results into tools for changing social practices, while leaving room for philosophical discussion about the aims of such interventions. Research work stimulates the development of languages of explanation, capable of translating experiences from the religious or mystical category into the category of psychological and social phenomena. Such a translation helps to clarify the mechanism of practices and makes them comprehensible to professionals in medicine and education. At the same time, work is required by translators of meaning who would preserve the deep motives of the practice and explain them as part of a life philosophy, not as a set of techniques. The social consequences of scientific interest manifest in changes in the status of teachers and mentors. Their role expands. They become participants in research projects, consultants on ethics, and sources of first-person descriptions. Interaction implies responsibility for the correct transmission of the practice in conditions where results are evaluated by criteria of reproducibility and effectiveness. And this raises the question of preparing teachers to participate in scientific initiatives. The boundaries of compatibility between science and the philosophical line lie in areas of ontological and methodological difference. Science is oriented toward explanation through measurement and modeling, whereas the philosophical tradition poses questions about meaning, motivation, and liberation. Within such borders, dialogue works when each side keeps its own gravity while openly discussing which questions it is prepared to put to the test and which remain the subject of internal inquiry. Ethical aspects of research require careful treatment of the subjectivity of practitioners. Experimental work seeks to take into account issues of informed consent, cultural sensitivity, and long-term consequences of implementing practices in clinical contexts. The attitude toward instruments of intervention becomes a matter of professional self-awareness. How does the responsibility of teachers and researchers change when their work attains institutional and commercial outlets? Funding and institutional interests shape the conditions for the field's development. The emergence of foundations and grants encourages the creation of large-scale studies, but at the same time requires constant oversight to ensure that the aims of research correspond to stated ethical and philosophical orientations. Methodological transparency and open access to results provide the possibility of public and academic verification, which increases trust in the results and reduces the risk of instrumentalizing the practices. Technical questions of measuring compassion and ethical motivation have led to the development of new assessment tools. A combination of behavioral tests, neuroimaging, and questionnaires has created a complex data matrix from which correlations and possible causal links are extracted. Such a comprehensive approach improves understanding of which elements of practice exert key influence and helps formulate recommendations for different age and social groups. The emergence of replication studies strengthens the scientific reliability of results and encourages detailed protocolization of practices. Replication requires standardization, which pushes practitioners to more carefully formulate their methods. This acts as a disciplining factor for knowledge transmission, while opening opportunities to identify those aspects that depend on cultural context and individual lives of training. The philosophical benefit of such a dialogue lies in producing a more precise picture of human variability. Empirical data on how attention is trained and motivations are transformed become materially operable theses for the philosophy of mind. This creates a platform for more detailed discussion of questions about free will, moral habits, and character education, translating abstract reflections into discussions based on observed dynamics of change. One practical task is training professionals capable of working at the intersection of disciplines. Educational programs in which future researchers receive instruction and methods for studying consciousness and in the practical side of the tradition help form an ethical and methodological culture. These specialists act as a linking element, supporting the quality of research and the correctness of implementing practices in social institutions. Contexts of application require distinguishing between testing effectiveness and making claims about meaning. Effectiveness is measured by changes in symptomatology or indicators of cognitive function, while the meaningful side is connected with what goals and values accompany the practice. Preserving this duality helps avoid compressing philosophy into a merely useful technique and leave space for moral reflection when introducing innovations. The long-term impact of scientific dialogue manifests in the institutionalization of practices within professional spheres. The appearance of courses included in training programs for psychologists and physicians changes the practical field and the perception of what is considered permissible in work with consciousness. This process requires systematic care to ensure that the value foundations of transmission remain transparent and accountable, rather than dissolving into the pragmatics of efficiency. A critical perspective emphasizes the risk of losing ultimate meanings in exchange for measurable results. A strategy for preserving integrity includes developing ethical codes, training researchers in cultural sensitivity, and involving practitioners in designing studies at early stages. Such an approach creates conditions for respectful and responsible development of the field, where scientific knowledge amplifies rather than replaces philosophical content. The philosophical potential of dialogue with science
appears in the creation of a new form of rationality that combines empirical rigor and reflexive depth. This form of rationality can pose questions about the purposes of human life, rely on verifiable data, and at the same time maintain attention to issues of motivation, meaning, and responsibility. It brings ideas about the development of the mind closer to practical institutions while leaving room for further philosophical reflection. A practical recommendation for institutional development is to build partnerships based on mutual listening and transparency. Research and educational programs that include representatives of the tradition as equal partners create a basis for sustainable and ethically justified practices. This gives a chance to transform scientific interest into long-term infrastructure where philosophical depth and empirical justification go hand in hand. The conclusion of the thought about this dialogue is that it opens the possibility of responding to contemporary challenges through a combination of inner discipline and public verification. The development of methodologies, institutional forms, and ethical norms determines the character of the tradition's modernization. Preserving the link between philosophy and practice requires constant work on research methods, attentive treatment of meanings, and deliberate management of the process of transforming social practices. Dialogue with the scientific community enters into direct connection with the image of the teacher, through experiencing his habits and manners, because outward behavior affects the perception of the teaching and shapes followers' expectations. One should consider personal style as a practical form of philosophical message, where the simplicity of everyday actions serves as an argument. Everyday actions in public life become a form of preaching, where every ritual detail, every word of an easily accessible explanation works to root ideas of compassion and responsibility. In this reading, clothing, manner of greeting, and choice of topics function as elements of ethical communication rather than as an external shell. The manner of speaking tends toward directness and empathy, which makes philosophical positions visible to a broad audience. Language becomes a tool for lowering barriers between abstract reflection and practical behavior. Because a simple metaphor or a brief case from daily life turns into a means of conveying complex positions about the causality of motivations and the nature of responsibility. The vocabulary avoids technical terminology while retaining conceptual precision, which allows listeners to experience an idea rather than merely internalize a set of rules. Humor as a rhetorical strategy serves to ease tension when talking about serious matters and creates the emotional closeness necessary for accepting moral demands. Observing audience reactions shows that light irony opens space for self-criticism and self-observation, making possible the admission of mistakes without loss of authority. Laughter in presenting difficult topics acts as a therapeutic element that fosters readiness to change behavioral attitudes. Modesty in everyday life and public acts builds trust because consistency between teaching and way of life creates coherence of authority. Visible agreement of words and deeds functions as institutional capital. People tend to trust those who demonstrate consistency, and this factor affects the durability of influence in the long term. The consequences of such trust are felt in the willingness to follow advice and in support for collective initiatives. The public example contains an important political component, since an image of simplicity and respect for others serves as a behavioral model for the diaspora and for international allies. Modeling conflict management through a calm speech manner and the refusal to insult forms a moral standard that becomes part of diplomatic style. This moral standard creates an expectation that other actors will behave with restraint and with regard for human dignity. Openness to dialogue is combined with the ability to maintain personal boundaries, which contributes to the stable functioning of the institution and prevents the permanent exploitation of the person. Ethical discipline is manifested in competent allocation of time between public obligations and inner work, which provides predictability in decision-making and protects the mentor's resources from burnout. Such a way of organizing life serves as a model of attention management in the social environment. Public practices include work with media and modern technologies, while the communication style remains adapted to the times. Use of mass media is accompanied by interest in how content changes form and how form affects content. This encourages the development of new formats for conveying ideas, short talks, dialogues with scientists, joint projects with educational institutions. Technological adaptation does not neutralize depth if, when choosing a format, the focus on reducing suffering and cultivating empathy is preserved. Attitude to ritual expresses a balance between respect for tradition and the practical necessity of adaptation. Rituals act as shared orienting markers of cultural memory, while their format is simplified where justified by conditions of emigration and exchange of cultural codes. Preserving the meaning of ritual actions requires careful attention to context, so that symbols continue to function as reminders of values, rather than turning into formal shells. Physical manifestations of habits, such as the way of greeting, sitting, or moving, play the role of nonverbal messages that are perceived more quickly than verbal explanations. Nonverbal communication creates a sense of the leader's humanity and accessibility, and the consistency of such manifestations serves as an anchor of trust. Consistent nonverbal rhetoric strengthens belief in the sincerity of statements and reduces the cognitive gap between words and deeds. The economic aspect of lifestyle is important for the ethical perception of leadership, since rational allocation of funds and transparency regarding support for the community elicit respect. Responsible financial policy of an institution demonstrates respect for the sacrifices and donations of supporters, and this leads to strengthening positions with an international audience. Economic modesty and discipline encourage discussion about moral management of resources and create material for philosophical debate about the right to comfort in service. The image of the teacher as being in constant search of knowledge forms a cultural model of engagement with the tradition's heritage. Interest in studying new disciplines and in communicating with representatives of other forms of knowledge functions as a practical illustration of the idea of the labors of mind and heart. The example of a teacher who continues to learn stimulates the structure of education and encourages critical thinking among practitioners. A teaching style based on dialogue fosters the habit of listening and asking questions. This method contributes to developing responsibility in listeners because it translates passive consumption of knowledge into active work on its application. The dialogical form of education creates an environment where moral demands take the form of personal obligation rather than an external agenda. Emotional sincerity in public speeches contributes to forming trust, because openness about doubts and mistakes helps people see a model of honest self-examination. Acknowledging the limits of one's perspective constitutes an ethical practice that teaches recognizing boundaries of understanding and addressing others with respect. Such a stance strengthens moral authority and encourages care in statements. Rituals of transmitting knowledge and the model of respect for different schools of thought create an ecosystem where diversity of interpretations is maintained as a value. Internal policy oriented toward respect for differences fosters in followers the habit of seeing value in the multiplicity of approaches. This practice builds sociocultural resilience
and reduces tendencies toward polarization among adherents. The principle of personal example extends to relations with younger generations, since communication style affects their ideas about social responsibility. Ways of engaging youth through modern educational programs and joint projects create platforms for transmitting values in forms understandable and acceptable to new generations. Investment in youth education functions as a long-term strategy for maintaining the viability of ideas. The shift to the question of legitimacy is connected with the fact that institutional stability relies on historical formulas of recognition and on contemporary receptivity to moral authority. Instances for recognizing reincarnations are embedded in the cultural code, and the functioning of their process depends on community consent. Legitimation mechanisms rely on a combination of traditional practices and modern transparency in decision-making. Legal and political frameworks of the environment exert a constant influence on the ways of confirming authority, since international agreements and the internal policy of other states shape the conditions for an institution's functioning. These conditions necessitate procedural flexibility to preserve the ability to continue performing spiritual functions amid changing external circumstances. Flexibility is manifested in creating procedures that take into account both sacred premises and the requirements of contemporary interaction. Religious legitimacy rests on the community's faith in the consistency of teaching and practice, and that faith includes assessment of the quality of mentorship. Quality assessment includes careful observation of the leader's ability to maintain moral standards and to inspire work on the self. Reliable leadership is built around recognition of practical results, informing character among followers. Procedures for selecting successors constitute a complex set of symbolic actions and organizational decisions, since they must ensure continuity of meaning as well as adaptation to new conditions. The formal side of the procedure requires documentation and coordination, while the substantive side focuses on ensuring the transmission of values. Transparency of procedures helps reduce uncertainty and strengthen trust in decisions. International support plays the role of an additional source of recognition when global civil institutions and religious communities express respect and attention. Such support creates a network of solidarity that amplifies the institution's voice on the world stage. The network of interactions works with a guarantee of visibility and as a channel for spreading ideas in secular and spiritual spaces. Questions of legitimacy include ethical responsibility for heritage, since decisions made today form the premises for subsequent generations. Responsibility manifests in the effort to preserve orienting meanings and in caring that the former transmission remains understandable and viable. The duty of custodians is to ensure a sustainable link between past and future through moral guideposts. Transparency in communication about the institution's future is important to reduce speculation and rumors that undermine trust. Open discussions in which arguments and considerations are set out coherently help people understand the logic of decisions made and participate in the recognition process. Transparency creates space for collective reflection on development paths. If one considers possible scenarios for the institution's development, it is advisable to highlight lines in which preservation of meaning is combined with procedural renewal. Rethinking forms does not mean losing content when transformations are aimed at strengthening the ability to transmit values in new conditions. Adaptation may include clarifying criteria, strengthening the role of community institutions, and expanding educational efforts aimed at preparing future leaders. Ethical dilemmas associated with the succession procedure include questions of responsibility for consequences and criteria for assessing the moral suitability of candidates, since decisions of this kind have far-reaching consequences for the community. Thoughtful weighing is based on the principles of compassion, wisdom, and openness to different arguments. A process grounded in ethical principles contributes to the legitimacy of outcomes.
The interrelation between internal authority and external political dynamics requires constant attention because political pressures and diplomatic expectations influence the perception of the institution in the world. Preserving independence in forming a spiritual line requires a clear justification of choices, accessible to understanding both inside and outside the community. Such justification is built through consistent explanation of motivations and decision-making methods. Institutional strengthening occurs through the practice of consistently applying principles and through creating feedback mechanisms. Feedback from followers, from experts, and from the international audience serves as an indicator of the correctness of changes made and helps identify areas for refinement. Feedback mechanisms include regular discussions, expert consultations, and public reports on the work carried out. The position of the Chinese state invariably sets the bounds of permissible action and the format of external communications. So the strategy of spiritual leadership in exile is determined not only by internal principles, but also by analysis of possibilities on the international stage. From this follows the need to take into account the real mechanisms of international pressure and diplomatic channels when choosing tactics for addressing states, organizations, and the public. A policy built on principles of compassion and nonviolence, despite its moral strength, gains influence through the ability to juxtapose moral arguments with instruments of international politics. Such a combination requires discipline in public rhetoric and clarity in formulations, so that the moral message is compatible with the requirements of diplomacy and the expectations of partners. China's economic weight and geopolitical role make interaction with the outside world a matter of constant calculation for those engaged in defending the rights and culture of the Tibetan people. State trade and investment activity creates incentives for a number of countries to shape relations with Beijing with an eye to economic interests. So the question of supporting initiatives in favor of popular rights is linked to an assessment of risks and benefits. Analysis of these factors helps outline a layer of strategies in which moral argumentation is complemented by legal, cultural, and humanitarian initiatives aimed at expanding space for dialogue and creating channels for independent voting by international actors. International diplomacy responds not only to official memoranda, but also to the power of symbols, which is manifested in global attention to the fate of minorities and to questions of cultural autonomy. In this sense, the figure of a spiritual leader functions as a resource of cultural diplomacy, able to mobilize sympathy and create a platform for interstate discussion. Practical work with state and non-state structures includes drafting materials, lobbying at the level of expert communities, and creating long-term educational programs that strengthen perception of the problem as a question of human rights and cultural heritage. Organizational forms of the diaspora in host countries affect the range of available political options, because the degree of institutional cohesion and the capacity for coordinated action determine the level of influence. Strong networks within the diaspora create prerequisites for sustained international activity through civic initiatives, cultural projects, and legal appeals. At the same time, every tactical decision is preceded by an assessment of the consequences for the safety of people and for the ability of a sustainable political institution to maintain moral authority on the international stage. The media space has become an arena of competing narratives, where the effectiveness of an informational strategy is determined by the ability to convey complex ideas in simple language and persuasively substantiate ethical messages. Social platforms and global news channels influence perception of events faster than traditional diplomatic protocols, so special attention is paid to creating consistent visual and verbal images
that withstand the test of time and respond attentively to shifts in the information field. Content work includes producing educational materials, using eyewitness testimony, and joining forces with journalists for fact-checking and independent coverage of issues. Technological infrastructure changes the conditions of interaction and creates new threats to security and privacy. Surveillance tools and cyber operations can affect dispersed communities in exile, so communications planning takes the existence of such risks into account and includes recommendations for protecting channels of communication. This aspect requires a combination of technical literacy and caution in public statements, so as to preserve the ability to act effectively while minimizing danger to individuals and organizations. The legal toolkit of the international system offers paths for drawing attention and for formally expressing claims, although each path has its own procedural limitations. Appeals to international bodies, use of judicial mechanisms and initiating investigations, summon expertise and create a documented basis for discussing human rights issues. Consistent legal work gives a chance to form a long-term body of argumentation that serves as a support for political and cultural work and allows the issue to be kept in the international discourse. Contacts through indirect channels and intermediary structures are used as a way to maintain dialogue amid high complexity. Religious organizations, research centers, and cultural institutes function as flexible intermediaries that can build bridges without rigid political commitments. This approach expands the spectrum of possible interactions and creates space for exchange of ideas outside official diplomacy, while requiring careful assessment of the moral and practical acceptability of each form of communication. Cultural diplomacy remains a powerful tool for building long-term support, since language, art, and religious practices act as means of conveying a sense of community and respect for heritage. Educational programs, exhibitions, and joint research projects strengthen understanding and lower perceptual barriers, providing a stable basis for international sympathy. Systematic work in this area requires investment in language education and in programs for preserving traditions, so that cultural codes remain alive and can be effectively represented beyond the homeland. Economic mechanisms include a combination of direct and indirect instruments of influence, where sanction initiatives, explanatory work with business elites, and targeted transparency campaigns can create an environment favorable to protecting interests. Economic ethics and transparency requirements for international projects create a field for drawing attention to aspects that concern the right to cultural autonomy and humanitarian aid. Every economic step requires an assessment of consequences for community resilience and for the long-term ability of the institution to perform its spiritual and educational functions. Partnerships with international non-governmental organizations and academic centers provide access to expertise and to platforms for expressing positions. These ties form a support network that acts as an amplifier of voice and as a channel for disseminating thematic studies and recommendations. Coordinating actions with these partners requires transparency of goals and the willingness to jointly develop materials that are understandable to a broad audience while withstanding scholarly scrutiny. Non-state actors within the global public sphere contribute through mobilizing public opinion, organizing campaigns, and creating public debates. Involvement of well-known authors, researchers, and public figures multiplies the visibility of complex issues and brings them onto the agenda of state bodies. This work updates the topic and shifts it from frequent emotional reaction into the field of systemic discussions, where constant lines of support and expert intervention are formed. Strategic thinking is aimed at a long horizon, taking into account that cultural and spiritual resilience is measured in generations, not instant victories. Investments in education, documentation, and the transfer of skills lead to the creation of sustainable cultural capital that retains the ability to self-restore amid external shocks.
Designing such programs implies detailed work with curricula, archives, and mechanisms of knowledge transmission, so that a resource remains for future leaders and for preserving collective memory. The situation regarding confirmation of succession in the spiritual institution has a direct impact on international dynamics, because questions about the order of transfer in authority attract close observation from global actors. Ensuring transparency of procedures and using internationally understandable standards can reduce speculation and give external partners grounds for more confident support. To the same extent, every institutional initiative in this area is accompanied by the necessity to assess legal and political consequences on the international stage. Adapting procedures for the sake of international trust requires thoughtfulness and respect for tradition, since steps toward modernization can strengthen legitimacy when they are supported by open discussion and documented criteria. These changes become a topic of continuous communication with interested actors, and openness creates conditions in which the institution's statements are perceived as justified and consistent. The stability of such a course depends on the ability to demonstrate practical results in education, community welfare, and protection of cultural heritage. The ethical stance regarding the actions of another center of power consists in maintaining commitment to the principles of humanity and compassion, while simultaneously using all peaceful means to protect interests. Adopting such a strategy requires clarity in communication modules and discipline in tactical decisions, so that international partners can recognize consistency of positions and evaluate them in terms of responsibility. Preserving moral clarity becomes a condition for long-term sustainability of influence on the world stage. Risk management and ensuring the safety of activists and institutions becomes a practical element of strategy, since protecting lives and freedom of action remains a primary task. Threat assessment procedures, trainings in information security, and measures for legal support form a protection system that allows activity to be conducted without insurmountable harm to individuals and to civic structures. This technical accompaniment strengthens moral work and increases the chances of a sustainable presence in international dialogue. Forming communication formats understandable to an international audience supports the ability to convey messages about rights and cultural identity through the language of simple images and empathetic narrative. Humor, accessible metaphors, and everyday examples increase listeners' trust and make ideas closer to practical solutions. It is important to combine such forms with an accurate factual basis in order to maintain the trust of experts and the public, while simultaneously broadening the number of those willing to engage in support. Developing scenarios of possible futures and preparing for them creates space for decision-making based on probability analysis and assessment of influence tools. Considering different trajectories of international development allows flexible plans to be devised that include elements of diplomacy, legal protection, cultural work, and education. Such a systemic approach makes the strategy resilient and helps keep the focus on the institution's main priorities. A combination of moral strength, institutional transparency, and adaptive diplomacy forms the basis for continued influence in the international sphere. Preserving cultural heritage and caring for the welfare of communities remain at the center of this line, while work with state and non-state actors serves as a means of achieving goals. Open questions concern the degree of possible integration of modern procedures with tradition, and which paths will prove most viable for maintaining identity and protecting rights amid global change. This dilemma sets the basis for a unified view of the institution, doctrine, and foreign policy, where each element functions as an interdependent module in a common system of meaning and action. Assembling this picture relies on understanding compassion as an ethical matrix, institutional transparency as a legitimizing mechanism, and adaptive diplomacy as a way to translate moral arguments into the languages of international law and public opinion. Such a vision allows the Dalai Lama to be viewed not merely as a symbol or a speaker, but as an architect of a practice in which spiritual discipline is transformed into a social technology for influencing identity and rights. The unified perspective reveals the interconnections between personal example and institutional procedures, between ritual memory and educational programs, between empathetic upbringing and legal argumentation on the international stage. The source of strength of this line is the concept of compassion presented as practical knowledge applicable to everyday decisions and political strategies.
The reason for its effectiveness lies in the fact that compassion translates moral evaluation into behavioral guidelines, sets criteria for priorities, and builds an ethical field for interaction with partners. The construction looks like this. A particular ethical stance sets rules of communication. Those rules are formalized into institutional norms, and those norms become the subject of international discussion when they are backed by an evidence base and educational initiatives. The limitations of this scheme are visible in its vulnerability to instrumentalization and to loss of depth in superficial transmission of meanings. Western reception of Buddhist ethics has created an effect of secularization in which basic ideas gain universal formulas and simplified recipes for moral behavior. An example of such transformation is the mass adaptation of mindfulness practice as a technique for stress management, rather than understanding it as a fusion of ethics, metacognition, and an ontological view of suffering. This example shows where the approach breaks. When philosophical integrity is layered apart under the influence of commercialization, and when contextual meanings are lost in translation into the attention economy. A sustainable strategy requires preserving semantic density in explanations. Otherwise, international resonance diminishes the depth of influence. Forming trust in the institution depends on a combination of transparency of procedures and the ability to present complex criteria in an accessible form. The arrangement of such transparency consists of documenting procedures, openly communicating criteria for succession, and involving external expertise to validate procedures. The consequences of accountability include reduced speculation and strengthened international support, because external actors gain grounds for long-term cooperation. The boundaries of this approach are revealed in legal and political contexts where standards of international law and state interests set the framework of possible influence. Practical ethics proposed within the line functions as a set of guidelines for behavior in social relations, in the attention economy, and in institutional leadership. It operates through concrete recommendations regarding conflict, complaints, and allocation of resources, with its strength crystallized through public example and through educational programs that transmit these guidelines to the next generation. This arrangement creates social habits that, over time, form cultural capital. However, the effect is slow, and supporting it requires institutional mechanisms to consolidate practices. The diplomatic line, built around nonviolence, represents a technique of translating moral arguments into legal and political formats. The mechanism here consists in nonviolence functioning as an attractive symbol and as a practical tactic, providing a moral rhetorical foothold for negotiations and for appeals to international institutions. Consequences include expansion of the network of sympathies and creation of conditions for initiatives that rely on human rights and cultural autonomy. A limiting factor for this technique is the ability of major actors to revise calculations in light of economic interests and reputational risks. A communicative style based on simplicity and humor functions as a means of overcoming perception barriers and as a tool for strengthening public empathy. The construction of this style includes simplifying complex ideas without desacralizing them, choosing metaphors close to the audience, and using story as a pedagogical device. The result is an expansion of the circle of people ready to receive deep ethical messages and the emergence of platforms for intercultural dialogue. Boundaries appear in the danger of oversimplification when layers of meaning are reduced to slogans and lose their substantive foundation. Interaction with science creates space for two-way exchange, where Buddhist reflections on consciousness are enriched by academic methods, and scientific research gains alternative perspectives on questions of subjective experience. The arrangement of this connection implies experimental programs, joint conferences, and educational initiatives that bring philosophy into the realm of empirical analysis. Consequences include dissemination of ideas through academic networks and the formation of an interdisciplinary vocabulary. Limits lie in differing methodological goals, when empirical measurement does not encompass existential meanings. The technological environment creates new challenges for preserving privacy and security, because digital channels simultaneously accelerate the spread of ideas and increase vulnerability of communications. The technical layer of work requires having protection tools, data management policies, and digital hygiene practices integrated into the overall communication strategy. Consequences of proper integration include increased resilience of networks and the possibility of secure information exchange. Limitations are related to the fact that technical protection cannot fully shield people from geopolitical risks and requires constant adaptation. Partnership ties with the non-governmental sector and academic institutions provide access to platforms for study, monitoring, and advocacy, when joint projects create a documented basis for international appeals. The mechanism of working with partners implies joint development of materials, transparent alignment of goals, and preparation of materials that withstand scholarly verification. Consequences include expanding channels of influence and strengthening argumentation. Limits consist in the need to avoid dependence on external voices that may reframe the topic in line with their own interests. The economic component of the strategy is expressed in using transparency tools, working with the business community, and careful use of economic arguments in public campaigns. The mechanism of such influence relies on demonstrating reputational risks and mobilizing demands for transparency in projects affecting cultural resources. Consequences include attracting attention from business circles and reducing risks of unilateral initiatives. Boundaries in this area lie in the difficulty of forecasting economic benefits and in the fact that financial interests can shift the priorities of public discussion. Network structures of the diaspora form a set of coordination practices, leadership training, and creation of channels for cultural and legal support. The arrangement of these networks relies on active community engagement, development of self-governing institutions, and transfer of competencies through mentorship programs. Consequences are long-term resilience and the ability to influence international platforms. Limits manifest in a limited resource base and the need to manage internal polarization. The cognitive side of influence consists in the ability to transform attitudes toward identity through educational programs that combine study of language, history, and ethical principles. The mechanics of working with memory include creating archives, educational materials, and cultural projects that make heritage accessible and alive. Consequences of this work are strengthening collective memory and increasing cultural capital. Limitations consist in the fact that educational changes require time and systemic support to reproduce results. The risk of distortions arises in external interpretation of a philosophical message as an apolitical utopia, when moral categories are used to create emotional resonance devoid of concreteness. An example lies in situations when words about compassion circulate separately from institutional work on protecting rights and welfare. This distorts the idea of how the philosophy is implemented in practice and reduces its effectiveness in the political dimension. Combating distortions obliges keeping the link between speech and action, maintaining a documented strategy, and involving expertise to verify the correspondence between statements and practices. The problem of legitimacy in the transfer of authority requires a combination of tradition and modern standards of transparency. The adaptation mechanism consists of clarifying procedures, disclosing criteria, and engaging external consultants to review the process. Consequences include a reduction of doubts and strengthening of international trust, which facilitates cooperation. The limits are that any procedure remains susceptible to political pressure and needs institutional safeguards. Ethical resilience requires ongoing work on internal institutions so that displays of personal modesty are accompanied by tangible social programs supporting communities. The mechanism of this linkage lies in integrating practical projects into the Institute's strategies, evaluating their impact, and in public reporting. The consequences are an increase in moral authority and heightened trust from the international community. Limits arise from constrained resources and the need for sustainable management. Scenarios of possible futures serve as a tool for planning and for preparing institutions for multiple development trajectories. Methodologically, this includes developing options, analyzing probabilities, and creating adaptive plans capable of responding to changes in the political and technological landscape. Consequences: increased flexibility and reduced risk of strategic mistakes. The constraining side remains the inevitable uncertainty, requiring regular revision of assumptions. The key pillars of this line are clear and can be formulated as concentrated theses that define its scope and orientation. The first pillar is the philosophical centrality of compassion as practical knowledge influencing decisions and ways of life. The second pillar is institutional transparency, which supports trust and strengthens international ties. The third pillar is adaptive diplomacy, which translates moral arguments into comprehensible formats of legal and political interaction. The fourth pillar is the resilience of cultural memory, ensured by systematic educational and archival programs. The fifth pillar is flexible coordination of the diaspora and partnerships, creating opportunities for sustained presence in international discourse. Remaining questions concern ways to preserve semantic density while expanding the audience, ways to minimize the risks of instrumentalization, and methods to protect vulnerable people and institutions in the digital age. These issues are significant because they determine the limits of the effectiveness of philosophical convictions in social practice and affect the Institute's ability to